So today we're going to walk through the process of how to make honey wine, which is also commonly referred to as mead. The first thing to consider when you're making honey wine is what kind of honey you want to use and how much. Today we're using 15 pounds of wildflower honey. There are a lot of different kinds of honeys out there, and you will find that some of the flavors in the honey does transfer into the final product. So if you get a clover honey, you might have a clover flavor. Wildflower honey has kind of a nice taste. The amount of honey you put in also has a factor on the finished product. Today we're going to use a 5-gallon carboy, which is standard for extract beer making. You'll also see 6-gallon carboys, which are more for extract wine making. So obviously you'll have to factor in your ratio of honey to water based on the final resting place. Now I've tried brewing a lot of different ratios of honey to water. I found that I like 3 pounds of honey per gallon of water. If you do 3.5 pounds or 4 pounds of honey, it'll be sweeter. Anything after 4 pounds of honey per gallon of water is going to taste more like a dessert wine. If you cut as low as 2.5 pounds or 2 pounds of honey per gallon of water, it's going to be a lot drier. Might not have the same alcohol content. And once you have your honey and you've worked out your honey water ratio, the next most important part is the type of yeast. I generally use the Red Star dry champagne yeast. This has a fermentation capability of up to 15%. There are a lot of yeasts available. You'll want to look at the fermentation temperatures of the yeast as well as the alcohol content and find the yeast that you like that's going to work best for your environment. Another item you might want to look at is yeast nutrient. This helps with the fermentation process. It doesn't add to the alcohol content per se, but it helps keep the yeast alive long enough to finish its job. Now the final ingredient of making honey wine is of course water. They say as long as it's drinkable, you can use it to make beer or wine. I know some people want to do distilled water, and that's certainly an option. We're heating up about 3 gallons of water right now. Now people have been making honey wine for about 5,000 years, so there's certainly a lot of different ways to do it. My process has always been to heat up the water and then pour in the honey and then scrape off anything that you find skimming on the top. It's usually like wax or any kind of impurities in the honey. You could actually skip that step if you wanted to and go straight to your kind of pre-fermentation or primary fermentation phase, but I'll walk you through my process. So when the pot's heating up, I also like to heat up the honey. I'm just pouring hot water on it right now. It'll make it pour out of the jug a little bit easier than if you just try to pour it cold. So go ahead and heat those up while you're heating up your water. Alright, so the honey is nice and warm now, which means it'll pour easier. And the pot's starting to warm up. So we'll go ahead and pour the honey in. Even though we're making a 5-gallon batch, it's not necessary to heat up 5 gallons of water. We'll just top. Alright, so now I'm just pouring the honey into the pot. You want to make sure that when you're first filling up the pot that you don't put in too much water. You might be tempted to fill up the pot all the way, but as you're pouring in the honey, that is going to displace the water and fill you up. So right now we're at about 4 gallons, which is perfect. Gives us a little bit of room to work with, and then we'll top up that last gallon at the end. Now we want to dissolve the honey in the water, so I go ahead and stir it. We're not necessarily trying to bring it to a boil, we just want to warm it up, and as it warms up, any kind of wax or other impurities are going to. Now it's always important to have a drink while you're brewing, and this is actually a bottle of honey brandy. I'll go ahead and walk you through that on the next video, kind of a teaser, just how to turn your honey wine into brandy. It's pretty good. This was actually a 5-year-old honey wine that I went ahead and switched over to a brandy. When I do walk you through the process of making honey brandy, you'll see you do try to double down on the alcohol, so it's about 30%. So you gotta drink responsibly. So as it's heating up, you'll notice you kind of get this white foam on the top, and this is the stuff that I generally skim off. May not really be necessary, but once again, this is my process, so that's what I'm sharing with you. So I'm pretty happy with where everything's at right now. You can tell the honey's dissolved, kind of skimmed off some of that cream off the top, and then I'm going to go ahead and rack it or pour it directly into the 5-gallon carboy with help of the siphon. Now you have a couple options at this point. You could pour it into a plastic fermentation bucket and let it sit there until the fermentation was done, or you can go directly into the glass carboy. I've heard people say that if you ferment it in plastic, the plastic leaves a flavor behind. Really, honey wine has a pretty clean fermentation. There's not really a lot of sediment or anything at the bottom. So unlike beer or wine, it's not really necessary to ferment it in a plastic bucket. You can just leave it in the glass carboy throughout the entire process. So we're going to go ahead and pour it over there now. Alright, so now we have the honey wine in the carboy, and what I'm going to go ahead and do is now start topping it up with cool water to drop the temperature down a little bit. The goal now is to get it down to the temperature that we need for the yeast. So before we pitch the yeast, we want to aerate the honey wine a little bit. What I'm just using is a power drill, and this was actually the back of a synthetic spoon. So I'm going to go ahead and put that in it and stir it up. I'm also running a little bit of water, cool water on the side to help drop the temperature. And run this drill, aerate everything a little bit. Alright, so now that I'm at the temperature that I want to be to pitch the yeast, I'm going to go ahead and dump the yeast packet in and then aerate it some more. So the process of pitching the yeast can be pretty straightforward. Really, I'm just dumping the packet in. You could pre-dissolve it in water if you want, but in this case I'm just going to go ahead and dump it. The yeast nutrient is 1 teaspoon per gallon, so I'm going to go ahead and put in 5 teaspoons of yeast nutrient. Just dump it right in the top. Alright, so I'm going to go and put in the airlock. There's a couple different airlocks on the market. I've used a few. They really seem to all work the same. I would recommend investing in the synthetic cork, this style. It's a lot easier to work with than a standard cork and not that much more expensive. So now I've topped it up, I've aerated it, so I'm just going to push the cork in like that. Alright, so now that I got the airlock in place, I'm actually going to pour a little vodka in the top in order for the airlock to work. It has to be fluid in it. I like to use hard liquor for that. Alright, so that's it. So for the price of 15 pounds of honey, you get 5 gallons of honey wine, which actually works out to about 25 bottles. So you're probably paying $1, maybe $2 a bottle. As far as when can you drink it, now that it's in the carboy and sealed up, within a day or two it should start fermenting. Within maybe 3 or 4 days, if it doesn't start fermenting, you may have an issue. In that case, I would recheck your temperatures and maybe drop another pack of yeast into it. It won't hurt it to put additional yeast in it. In terms of how long you have to wait, I'd say 3 months is kind of your minimum. The stuff I was drinking earlier was actually 5 years old. Wouldn't want to go much longer than that, or really any less than 3 months. But technically, once it stops bubbling, it's done. So you could drink it then. But I'd give it a couple months if you can wait that long. At that point, you can bottle it. You can drink it with a straw out of the carboy, 1 gallon jugs, taps, whatever works for you. And that's your honey wine. Did have found that honey wine does take flavors nicely, so I used to mix some chai tea in with it. We also tried some white peony tea. You can do vanilla, cinnamon, a lot of different options. So once you get it, you can start experimenting with the finished product. I know there's an Elizabethan mead that actually does a white wine or fermented grapes in with it. Also, I think that lemonade goes well with it. So you've got your honey wine, you can experiment now and enjoy. Alright, so one last note, both air and sunlight are kind of your enemies. You don't want to let them get to your honey wine any more than you have to, so you want to store it in a dark place that holds the temperature you need for the yeast, and that should be on the back of the packet of yeast. And also you want to keep your airlock full, whether you're using hard liquor or something else. So you want to check that every once in a while, as it will evaporate out.